Let's talk about it now with someone who is a fantastic fighter for our freedoms during that time, journalist and columnist at The Telegraph, Allison Pearson. Very, very good morning to you, Allison.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you.
I was wondering where your damehood was for your noble fight in this great struggle.
Holding out for Empress, as indeed so should you as well. You and I were among the people who were criticising this. I have to say, I wasn't the first. I took at least 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks to come round to this because it was people like you, like Brendan O'Neill and Toby Young, people who were saying, we think this is all bad, we need to talk about this. They brought me around. I was already in lockdown when this announcement was made. I was already, I've got to be honest, very sick with COVID. I'd caught it a week earlier, and my whole family were isolating at the time, we were unwell. But this set in train an extraordinary set of events that we're going to be living with, not just we're living with right now today, but we're going to be living with for decades to come. What do you make of that moment, that decision? How do you feel when you hear those words?
It's pretty chilling, isn't it? Particularly when Boris mentions the police will have these powers. And I understand that people were afraid. People were paid to frighten us, Julia. Very, very gifted behavioural psychologists were being paid to make us feel afraid. I have no judgment on anyone who was scared. And like you, I thought maybe 3 weeks to flatten the curve.
That's what they told us, yeah.
Let the hospitals get their ducks in a row. That seemed perfectly legitimate. But then there was a sudden realization they're not going to give us our freedoms back. And what have we traded them for? And if you look back, Julia, you can think about all this madness. Like, what was the rule of six? I mean, there was just this craziness, wasn't there? Stuff that they made stuff up.
Well, we know that now. We know, again, one of our good friends, Isabel Oakeshott, she got hold of Matt Hancock's WhatsApps to help write his memoirs. I mean, what a fool he was there. She gave them, I think, the best bit of public service or journalism we've seen in many decades. We've given to the Telegraph, became public. We realise now that most of the decisions were made on a whim. They were just like, oh, well, let's do one over Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. Let's keep our kids in masks in schools for 8 hours a day as well in England. There was so little science behind any of this, so little thought, no cost-benefit analysis. The reason we locked down after months, by the way, of our scientific and medical advisors saying we wouldn't, and the Prime Minister assuring us we wouldn't, because we had a pandemic plan and it didn't involve lockdown, because lockdowns don't save lives. We knew that already. Was because of this Ferguson Imperial College computer model, which convinced Dominic Cummings that we were all going to die. And on a whim, government policy changed.
I think there was huge pressure. You've got this Neil Ferguson Imperial College model saying up to 500,000 people could be dead by whenever it was, November, if you don't lock down. So it would take a leader of real courage, wouldn't it, to say, hang on a minute, does that sound okay? So they were under huge pressure. Yeah. My main criticism would be certain things that were completely ludicrous, like chaining up children's playgrounds. Closing schools when children were at no risk from COVID. Absolute madness to do that. And we now see 1.5 million children, Julia, with speech delay, not making educational progress, huge absenteeism from secondary and junior schools. It's broken the bond of trust between parents and the authorities. Yeah. Parents used to say, you're going to school, don't worry, you've got a cold, get your coat on, you're going to school. Now, 800,000 children a week in secondary schools are being allowed to stay home. And I would suggest that's because parents think, well, you wouldn't let them into schools for 18 months so they can bloody well stay, excuse my French, they can stay home now.
It's optional now. And again, I said the schools thing, that was something, certainly I always, from word go, said that we should do. And we're often told, as you say, people were scared. The media were ramping that scaring up, and we know from our brilliant friend Laura Dodsworth, and she's done some fantastic work and a brilliant book about the level of fear that was deliberately engendered. There was a belief in government we weren't going to do as we were told, like other countries. We wouldn't give in. I'm still quite ashamed of a lot of my fellow Brits and how willing they were to be told to follow absurd rules. You know, again, every time I see one of those arrows or on a circle in a supermarket or in a train station, I have a visceral reaction to it. But people were genuinely scared, and we're constantly told we didn't know. We didn't know what we know now. It was understandable. Actually, we did. I've gone back and looked at some of the videos of interviews I was doing and some of the tweets and things I was writing in February 2020 and stuff that you were doing as well and other people. We did know that children were basically at pretty much no risk. We did know it was mostly people in their 80s and 90s who were at risk. We did know what the death rate was. We knew all of this stuff. It was just basically pumped up into a much bigger thing than it was. Now, the trouble is we kind of got into a debate where it seems to be there's people who basically say everyone was going to die, and if we didn't lock down, everyone's granny would have died. Abject nonsense. And people on the other side saying it's all a fiction, it was made up, there wasn't really a new disease, no one died from it. And neither of those things is true.
No, and I find that we're in this sort of purity Olympics, aren't we, where people like us who've got very legitimate objections to the terrible harm that's been caused, you know, someone like me will get told off for not having been sufficiently anti-vax or not having been sufficiently, you know, it's ridiculous, really.
I wore a mask on a plane, so obviously I'm part of the problem, you know.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of people trying to catch people out, and I think that was one of the worst aspects, is people were set against other people. It felt to me so fundamentally un-British. I even found myself seeing some neighbours in the garden with their elderly parents when that wasn't allowed, and part of me, Julia, actually for 1 second thought, oh, that's not allowed. And I thought, Alison, what are you doing?
Yes.
It's completely okay to be outside. That might be the last time you see your elderly parents. Let's not forget the suffering. Let's not forget elderly people, you know, husbands of people in care homes, children of people in care homes, not allowed to see their mums or dads.
Dads not being allowed at the birth of their children. Women having to go through miscarriages on their own because the partner wasn't allowed to be with them as they miscarried. I mean, some of the stories we did, one of the things I'm most proud of that we did do during that time, apart from just trying to keep people sane by being, I'm not being ourselves up, we were the only broadcaster questioning this, whereas every other broadcaster was sending a political editor to Downing Street going, why aren't you locking down more? Why don't you lock down for longer? Why don't you have stricter rules? The only time they got upset was when there was the Scotch egg rule, for goodness sake. But the amount of times we actually asked people to tell us your lockdown stories. So while everyone was focusing on, I'm so surprised that my 98-year-old mother in a care home has died, and I'm as sympathetic as we can be, that's not an unusual situation to be in. But we were talking to people, whose children had no education and were self-harming, to people who lost their businesses, to people who, living in domestic abuse, to people, again, not being able to see their mother in a care home, literally banging on the window and desperate to see them. People who were affected by this day in, day out. And in all of the anniversaries that have been, all the stories in the last few weeks that have been covered by the media, it's always about people who lost a loved one to COVID. Every time, and it's pretty much always somebody in their 80s or 90s, not focusing on the rest of the population who could have been living a pretty normal life all of that time and bringing no extra risk to their elderly loved ones.
Exactly, and we are now seeing, predictably, the increase of cancer deaths because younger people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who were not able to get a scan, who were not able to get a cancer diagnosis, they are now dying, Julia, in greater numbers, and they are younger population. And as you say, not to be disrespectful, but the average age of COVID, which came out when it was in Italy early in the pandemic, was 82.4 years.
Yeah.
As a society, we sacrifice children for the very elderly, and I don't think an earlier generation would have done that. I don't think the wartime generation would have thought that was acceptable. No. I think it was panic, it was mass hysteria, and as you say, lots of our broadcasting colleagues. I mean, I remember BBC Clive Myrie reporting from a morgue, in a morgue, right? There were people, flu presented a greater threat to the younger population than COVID.
And we'd never closed down. And again, we had pre-pandemic planning, and everyone was talking about how people like us, people who were talking about we need to follow what Sweden had done. And again, if you look at the stats for Sweden, from COVID deaths and deaths from other causes, damage to the economy, damage to children, their kids were all in full-time education up to the age of 16. They are pretty much the best in the world in terms of outcomes, because they followed pre-existing pandemic planning, which told us that you might think that you're saving lives, but you're not. And again, 3 weeks to flatten the curve while the NHS got its act together. We built Nightingale hospitals. That didn't seem unreasonable to me at the time. But once we went into it, we were never coming out. And actually, it was only the Partygate revelations that stopped us going into a lockdown in December 2021. We would have carried on doing it. I have to say, one of the things I still find most difficult is the number of people I know, well-to-do people. Our kids had 6 hours of Zoom lessons every day. The kids are doing fine. Parents had a lovely time, no problem with their income. And the number of them who still say to me, oh, but we had a lovely time during lockdown. I have to say, I have to bite my tongue and walk away, because I simply cannot trust myself to say things that not to say the wrong thing.
Well, look at the economy. 9 million people are economically inactive. Yep. We seem to have lost the habit of work. Those are working age people, Julia.
Yep.
They printed £450 billion.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? So now we've got a vast national debt that we're paying ever, 100 billion a year to service the interest on, and people wonder why why there's tough economic times.
Do you think the lessons will ever be learned? I think there's no point even mentioning the COVID inquiry. That's going to be a complete waste of time, an absolute whitewash. But do you think I'm not aware that any of my media colleagues have really learned the lesson, other than the fact they now are going, oh, isn't it terrible all these kids are onto an education? Isn't it terrible about our NHS? Do you think, yeah, and you guys you were calling me a COVID denier when I pointed this out in April 2020. Do you think the lessons will be learned?
Very reluctantly and very slowly. We are seeing huge progress in the United States under Trump. Jay Bhattacharya, one of our great colleagues in the COVID trenches, Julia, he's just been made the head of health services in the United States, and Jay has described lockdown as the biggest public health mistake in human history. So I think we're seeing a lot of lawsuits over there. They're flushing out the fact that this virus came from a Chinese lab. When we were saying that in the spring, summer of 2020, I was called racist. I was banned from Twitter. So I think that the truth is leaching out. I think there's huge embarrassment. Nobody will, Matt Hancock saying, let's scare the pants off everyone by releasing the news of the Kent variant a bit later. These people I think some of them should be in jail.
Oh,
personally.
I'm with you. I want criminal charges, absolutely. Allison Pearson, you've been such a wonderful, strong voice on this, and you're a great friend to me as well. And I know we have a number of colleagues who we were all out there in the trenches, and it's great to still have you fighting the good fight. Journalist and columnist at the Telegraph, Allison Pearson. Thank you for that.